what seems to have happened here is that caretaker Prime Minister Mark Rutte and his cabinet decided at some point in January that because of the emergence of these mutations in the virus, first the UK variant and then, of course, the South Africa variant, they needed to move very quickly to clamp down or to tighten their already tight lockdown by introducing this curfew, which they did on January the 23rd. The problem is they did it using emergency powers that would enable them to sideline Parliament and the Senate. And therefore no debate, no discussion, and just put it into place. Initially for 2 weeks, but then they extended it till March the 3rd. You may recall it gave rise to anti-lockdown protests across the country at the time. Well, one of those anti-lockdown protest groups took their protest to court. The court found in their favour on the basis that there was no legal basis for this law because the government had not acted appropriately and struck it down. What's now happening is that the government said, well, look, you know, this is a problem clearly for us in terms of maintaining our lockdown and our lockdown strategy. Can you suspend this verdict pending the outcome of a full appeal, which they plan to launch, and we await in the next hour or so before, of course, the lockdown is due to come into place tonight, a decision by this panel of judges as to whether or not to suspend that verdict, whether or not the lockdown should go ahead. Of course, as I said, it's worrying for the government. They've got this virus out there, they've got the variants out there, they've got the vaccine out there, but it's not coming on board nearly fast enough, and they will be very keen to try and keep a tight lid on the lockdown that they've already got in place.
And Jonah, here in the UK, 1.7 million more people are to be told to shield to protect themselves from serious side effects from COVID-19.
Yes, well, you know, similar dynamics here, except slightly in reverse. We have got the vaccine in the UK. It is being rolled out, but of course there are still several months ahead and an uncertain future beyond that with these variants around vaccine efficacy, what will or will not get through in time to come. So there is still and will always be concern about vulnerable groups. 2.2 million people already on the sort of shielding register deemed particularly vulnerable to the worst effects of COVID. Now, scientists from the University of Oxford have come up with a predictive risk modelling tool to expand that group of very vulnerable people by basically crunching a lot of data and spitting out a lot of names. And they've expanded the data that they use. They're not just looking at age and things like disease and so on, underlying health issues, a sort of very binary look at who is vulnerable. They're now expanding it to take into account socio-economic data, like ethnicity, like postcodes, where you live, who you live with, to try and give a picture of sort of levels of deprivation, which we know have fed very heavily into the negative COVID rates. So it's a new approach, socio-economic data being taken into play, which allows more people to be brought into this protective net, including, for instance, Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. We know that their communities have been very heavily affected. Many are key workers or essential workers. Many live in multi-generational households. Well, now they can be deemed people who need to shield. They can be given specific advice about their risk conditions. And most importantly, they can be given priority access to the vaccine if indeed they haven't had access to it yet.
Jonah Hull, thank you very much indeed.